So we're reviewing the first short trek for Star Trek Discovery Season 3. It is called Q&A. Now, we've heard a lot of negative reviews about this short trek, very negative reviews, and I've seen it already, and it requires, this is going to require an exhaustive analysis because there is so much wrong with this content, and there's so much wrong in such little time, in 14 minutes of video, that or even less than 14 minutes, that it's actually quite disturbing. And to think that this was written by Michael Chabon, who's the showrunner for Picard now, is quite worrisome. However, I personally feel that this is written. I personally feel that his writing of this short trek is Michael Chabon being extremely limited and controlled in what he is writing, and this happens sometimes to writers. Sometimes the writers don't have the liberty that fans might think they do, and in other words, they might have constraints. Now, Chabon is the showrunner for Picard, but he's just another writer for Discovery. So it's most likely the case that he is being, extremely constrained in writing this. And I think that it's not going to be really a fair judgment of Chabon's talent for the success of Picard, to evaluate him on the two short treks that he has written. We're gonna have to get to the second half of the season 1 of Picard to start to see what kind of showrunner Chabon's really going to be. Again, the first half of the first half of season 1 of Picard had already been filmed, and then they've been doing some reshoots. But apparently, most of the first half of Picard season 1 was pretty much done when Chabon had been given the reins. So the first thing we see wrong with the episode is when, at the very beginning, we see Spock beaming on to the Enterprise, and we see he has, kind of half a smile on his face. And right here, we're already seeing how the writers, in this case Chabon, and the writers and the direction and the whole production staff, they're not understanding decades of development of Vulcans and their personality traits. The Vulcans traditionally do have emotions, but their emotions are not this close to the surface. And you can already see how, at the very beginning of this short trek, you can already see how Spock's emotions are way too close to the surface for a Vulcan. And this is just the beginning of the episode. So Spock beams aboard, and he's, half smiling when he arrives on the Enterprise. And he then automatically goes into a kind of an emotional reaction to seeing the first officer, number one. And he speaks to her kind of in a very high tone, as if he was in the academy or something. And she says no need to yell, Spock. And this again is a misunderstanding by the writers of having Vulcan emotions too close to the surface. Spock's eagerness, if this were played by Leonard Nimoy or even Zachary Quinto, would not be this response would not be valid for Leonard Nimoy. Spock's eagerness cannot be this close to the surface. So they exit the transporter room, and the first officer, number one, goes into this dialogue about, she's critiquing Spock that he's been on the ship for 37 seconds and hasn't asked her a question yet. And that's not what she expects from a science officer. So this grilling of Spock by number one is meant to be shown as something typical you might see in a situation, in a military-oriented body, in this kind of situation. But the writers are trying to they're trying to come up with something that just makes no sense. And having the grilling of the young officer and having him ask questions for the sake of asking questions is not, it just does not make sense. And this is indicative that there's nobody in the writer's room with a military background. There's no consultant with a military background. It's just they're just going through and thinking. They're writing what they're imagining a Starfleet-like organization would be like, with no frame of reference. And even if the writers didn't have any kind of military backgrounds or a consultant with a military background, it's as if they hadn't even watched, and absorbed the decades of Trek that already exist. So number one goes on to tell Spock that she expects him to barrage everyone he comes across with questions. And his first question is, what is your name? And this really just this just says everything that's wrong with the writer's room at Star Trek Discovery at CBS. Her answer is, my name is number one. And in a military or pseudo-military like organization, this is not an acceptable response from her. It's one thing for the captain to call his first officer number one because he chooses to. But it's a whole different thing for the first officer to go and tell everyone on the Enterprise that her name is number one because she thinks it's a cool nickname. This is just utter nonsense. And I honestly believe that Michael Chabon is writing under many constraints in the short treks for Star Trek Discovery. And, hopefully we're going to see something very different in Picard. Otherwise, Picard's going to be a disaster. And let me just say again that the first officer on a vessel, on a Starfleet vessel, has got to, in this case, tell the ensign what her designation is, and her name and her rank. And this whole thing about call me by my nickname because I think it's cool is just ridiculous. And I'm sorry to say, but Gene Roddenberry, rest in peace. I'm sorry to say this whole episode is basically just a slap in the face to Gene Roddenberry. And I'm just going to make a side note here about something that to me is just very obviously wrong with Spock's appearance. And this may be this 25% difference that some people say doesn't exist, but it absolutely does exist. Spock's bowl haircut is just very different from what most Vulcans have had throughout the decades, and it's definitely different from Nimoy and Zachary Quinto, and And this is just another added factor that makes Spock feel off to the fans, because you're looking at him and there's something that's not quite right and you can't put your finger on it. And it's the fact that his eyebrows are almost touching his hair, basically, his hairline. And there is the whole hairline is just off, and it's intentionally off, and just an added factor apart from everything that's wrong with Spock's personality and the writing. It's just another added factor which makes Star Trek fans feel that Spock is off. It's not. It's not him. And let me say too, Gregory Peck's grandson is not being given a fair chance to play a great role as Spock, because the writing staff is just not respecting the character. And the merits in a writing staff are, not how much they can, deviate from an established character, but the true merits are how can we explore this character within the frame of the developed character that we already have. Now, let me say here that Rebecca Ramon stands out. The actress stands out as having, you can tell her, feel her presence on camera, and you can tell, she's a talented actress. Unfortunately, she's not being used properly. but she does stand out as a positive note in this short trek. She does stand out as well as Anson Mount, who comes across later in the episode. Both of them definitely stand out, and that speaks to them as actors. And now we get to the one of the most criticized points in this short trek is that they go into the turbo shaft and the camera shows the turbo lift, and shows the the turbo lift moving through the interior of the Enterprise. And what so many people have criticized is the vastness of this interior space where one and there's actually several turbo lifts are moving through the Enterprise. Some people have compared it to this roller coaster, which is not far off. It's a pretty accurate description, and just the lack of thought that's been put into all of Star Trek Discovery, it's very sad, because Star Trek has always been about science and engineering and scientific accuracy, as much as possible in the writing. There's always been scientific consultants in the rooms on prior Star Trek episodes, and literally it's as if the writing staff had no idea what they were doing. There are basic mistakes all over, and the fact that you're going to have a naval vessel, whether it's in the water or in space, to have such vast unused space within the ship is just it does not make any sense. It just doesn't make any sense. And I haven't heard anybody else mention this, but to me it seems like Spock is in this episode is continuously on the verge of smiling. And he's it's very subtle. But again, it goes to the point that Vulcans do not have their emotions this close to the surface. And it's done, it's very subtle, but I don't know. For me, it's subtle but obvious. Now, again, number one is going to give a response that is totally against. It's counterintuitive to how a military or pseudo-military organization is run. Her answers basically, they paint Pike in a light that is not leadership. So when you have a writer's room that's filled with soap opera writers, and it's not just that. It's the fact that it seems like the writer's room in Star Trek Discovery was full of people who are lacking in life experience, and I mean, we're saying that they're very young, they're very young, but what's really obvious here is that there's a lack of life experience, and that is evident in the decisions that are made in the writing of Star Trek Discovery in general. Now, of course, this is supposedly Michael Chabon's, short trek. However, I personally feel that Michael Chabon is under constraints here of some sort. And he has probably even had to yield to a kind of a group effort writing in the writer's room. That's my gut feeling on this. So getting back to number one's response to Spock about her three answers to about Captain Pike's most salient qualities. She says, 1, his capacity for hearing out another point of view is exceeded only by his willingness to change his own once he's heard you out. So this is utter and complete nonsense. Anybody who studies leadership will tell you that what she is saying is basically, what she's saying is what we saw in season 2 of STD. Captain Pike would say something, Michael Burnham goes up to him and says something else, and Pike ends up changing his mind because he's a good listener. And there is some truth to these qualities in a good leader, but this is not the example that she's giving is not describing a positive quality in a good leader. It's describing a leader who works in a democracy instead of in a leadership role. And the captain of a starship, the captain of a vessel is not gonna lead by democracy. And this is what she's describing, this kind of democracy leadership, this kind of democracy style, asking your subordinates what they think all the time. And this is something that in leadership studies is inefficient and actually leads to bureaucracy and paralysis of decision making. This makes utterly no sense, and it's indicative of the lack of life experience of the writing staff. In a military or pseudo-military organization, the captain of a vessel, or the commanding officer, cannot lead by in this fashion. They cannot lead by this kind of example of being so open to everybody's opinion, because it just leads to chaos in a command structure. Next, he goes to question 2, and she says that even though he is the most highly decorated combat officer in Starfleet, he views using violence as an admission of failure. And of course, this this again is utter nonsense in leadership studies. And the reason this is utter nonsense is because it all depends on context. There are moments where a leader has to use force, and a leader has to know that they've exhausted all the diplomatic solutions possibilities before resorting to force. But it doesn't mean that it's a failure, because there are situations in which that is required. And so what's missing here is context, and this amounts to just the writing here is just infantile. That's what it is. It's infantile, and it's agenda driven. And then she says 3, that the captain is largely unsentimental, except regarding horses. So anyway, that.